Hey there, and welcome to Broadband Deployment News. Jessica Rosenworcel, who's the chairwoman of the FCC, has come out with a post with some updates on the National Broadband Map and Broadband Fabric. Be right back, and we'll talk about that. Thanks for joining me. Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So I wanted to read through this. So this was a post on the FCC site, National Broadband Map, getting better all the time. And this is Chairwoman Rosenworcel speaking here. Said, back in November, I noted that these maps represented more of a beginning than an end, the new era of broadband mapping. In that spirit, it's important to note that we've come a long way in the short time since that November release. So what she's saying there is, we're beginning this process, but it's really not going to be an end. It's never going to end. It's always going to be constantly updated, but certainly there was a lot of work that had to be done in the beginning to be able to get these maps to a point where they're certainly much better than they were prior, before we were doing this whole new process. But this is something that's going to be ongoing. Our new systems are up and running and working, especially the challenge process. She says, our new maps were designed to constantly and consistently be refined through an iterative process. The centerpiece of this effort was setting up a robust challenge process where consumers and key stakeholders like state, local, and tribal governments could review our maps and let us know if our data matched their reality on the ground. Over the past 4 months, consumer and stakeholder engagement has been growing, and this feedback has been integrated into our data sets. So this is a process where there was first a broadband location fabric, which we'll hear about here. So that was the fabric that was created by CostQuest, and they call it a fabric, but basically it's a database of what is considered to be every single broadband serviceable location in the country, as well as territories. So those would be locations that should have broadband, don't necessarily have broadband, but that's been identified that should have broadband. So it could be very simple. It's a neighborhood with a bunch of houses, and each one of those houses should have broadband. It could be an apartment building, and we hopefully know how many units are in that building, and each one of those should have broadband. Or it could be very rural areas where you've got multiple buildings on maybe a farm or a rural property where you've got multiple buildings, and which one of those buildings is supposed to have broadband? Not every one, which one? That's kind of hard. It gets harder, obviously, as you get more in those rural areas, and there's some challenges with sometimes with some of these multi-dwelling units, multi-tenant units, and there's questions about which anchor institution should be on there, because anchor institutions were generally eliminated because it was determined that, well, they really wouldn't get broadband from your normal broadband service providers. They might get it, let's say, from the government, but that's certainly not always the case. So there's those kinds of things. But for the most part, a lot of it should have been easy. As far as identifying areas that are in urban and suburban areas, it gets more challenging as far as locations as you get in rural areas, and availability sometimes can be more challenging in locations because you've got maybe only one provider, maybe no providers, and that data can be challenging to get. She says here, on the availability side, so this is where service actually is. The FCC's mapping team has a system in place to collect these challenges and report them to the relevant internet providers who supply the availability data. So the first thing, again, that was done was the broadband, what's called the fabric, all of the areas that should have broadband. And then that first fabric came out mid last year, around June, and service providers had 3 months, approximately 2 to 3 months, it might have been 2 months, to upload their broadband, the areas where they provide service. So you've got all the locations in the database, and then each broadband provider is supposed to go into that fabric and say, okay, we provide service here. Our maximum advertised download and upload speed is X, Y. And let's see, our latency is, yes, it is less than 100 milliseconds per round trip, and a few little other items that they might put in there. But that's the crux of it. So that was done during that period. And then the first broadband, what they're calling pre-production broadband map, came out in November. And at that point, in addition to broadband fabric challenges that had been made prior to that, then broadband providers and cities and states and even consumers could start to challenge the availability data, because you could go right up on the map and say, wait a minute, if you're a consumer, wait a minute, I don't have broadband here. Or yeah, I have broadband, but I can't get a gig service. I've called about that, and the best I can get is maybe 50 meg or something like that. So that process was all taking place after November 18th or so, I think it was. And then the new updated broadband fabric, which took some of the original challenges, came out right at the end of the year. And then broadband service providers, right at the beginning of the year, started uploading their next round of broadband availability. So if they missed the first filing completely, then hopefully they were adding that information. There were some that didn't understand and maybe only loaded areas where they actually had a customer as opposed to could have a customer. So a lot of that has been worked out. And in some cases, broadband operators said they served an area and they weren't really being either they were being deceptive, and some were, or they just weren't being very careful and saying, you know what, we serve most of this area, and they were counting areas maybe that they didn't serve. So there's some of that has been challenged and been corrected as well. Obviously, I was searching for challenge in this document, so I'm just going to get rid of that. There we go. In the past, let's say here, let me finish this. So on the availability side, the FCC mapping team has a system in place to collect these challenges and report them to the relevant internet providers who supply the availability data. Providers then have 60 days to concede or dispute the challenge. To date, stakeholders, primarily state governments, have stepped up to produce more than 600 bulk challenges covering provider-reported availability at several million locations. So several million locations where they were challenging that data. And again, some of that may have been challenges of places that did have broadband and it wasn't showing because some providers didn't get their broadband information in there. In some cases, it would be places that said there was availability and there wasn't, or it could be based on maybe a particular service said it was supposed to be a higher speed and it was not, those kinds of things. In the past 4 months, our mapping team has processed challenges to availability data for over 4 million locations. In other words, on average, we are addressing availability challenges to tens of thousands of locations every single day. That's quite a job. Every 2 weeks, our public map is updated to reflect all availability challenges that have been resolved. In other words, the system is working. So if you go to the broadband map, every 2 weeks, as they're processing these challenges, you may see changes in that broadband map where it said an area had broadband service before and now it doesn't because somebody challenged that, or it could be vice versa, where maybe that wasn't on there and it is. So that's being updated every 2 weeks based on that kind of data, not necessarily location data, because the location data is based on the broadband fabric, and that was fixed as of, let's say, the end of 2022 when the new fabric came out. That was then fixed because then broadband providers needed something kind of static to be able to put their availability data on. She says our next maps will be noticeably better, thanks in large part to even better location data. Remember, the FCC's old maps had 0 systems for public feedback. So what she's talking about there is the whole reason we're doing this is the old FCC maps were based on census block data, where an internet service provider could look at a census block, and as long as they served one location, one house in that particular census block, they could count it as served, and they would, they might not serve the whole census block, or they might serve part of the census block with, let's say, a higher speed than another part of the census block, but they would pick the home where they had service and where they had the highest speed. So it was obviously not very accurate. But these new maps are based on, again, this broadband fabric that is supposed to be every single broadband serviceable location in the country. She says an even bigger improvement is that our maps now reflect broadband availability at the physical location level. So it's not the census block. You can't offer location level data without an accurate accounting of locations where fixed broadband could even be installed. That brings me to the evolution of our locations data set, the aforementioned fabric. The fabric was developed based on more than 200 public and commercial data sources ranging from public records to tax assessments to satellite imaging. And again, they contracted with a company called CostQuest who took all of that data. They had their own data that they had already put together, but they took other forms of information to try to determine what every location is in the country, every piece of property, and then on that property, they then had to, which ones should have broadband on a property. And then on that property, the really hard part was also which structure on this property needs to have broadband or should have broadband. So they had to look at satellite data. They did kind of their own process of trying to teach their AI system what roof structures look like that should have broadband. So they were trying to say, okay, well, on this property, we got 3 structures, and when you see a roof line like this was probably one that should have broadband. Maybe this one doesn't. So they were They couldn't obviously do that for every particular location in the country, but they went through a manual process of that, trying to teach their AI to recognize those things. And obviously there are going to be problems as you do that, because computers are not as smart as people, still, at least now, right? So anyway, that was kind of the process they went through to try to discover every single location in the country, and then specifically, which structures on a property. That brings me to the evolution of our location performance. Yeah, okay, as she mentions here, tax assessment, satellite imaging. Our first version of the fabric identified over 113 million locations where fixed broadband could be installed. For context on how much more granular this data is than our earlier maps, which were census block data, there are 8.1 million census blocks. So you can see again, it's going to be more granular, more accurate as far as who really has broadband in an area and who doesn't. She says, we've largely completed work on the second version of the fabric, and I can definitively say that we have taken a big step forward. I've seen some reports that say she was mistaken here and meant to say broadband maps, that they've largely completed work on their broadband map. But I really do think she means fabric here. Now, maybe she meant to say third version of the fabric. Maybe she's saying, because the second version of the fabric would have been the one that was out in January. Or maybe like end of December. So maybe she meant to say third fabric, or maybe she's saying that they've been making updates they're still making updates to the fabric that I don't see how they could, though, because broadband providers have been uploading their availability data on the fabric. So I don't know, but I don't think that means the map. And part of the reason I say that is because she continues to talk about the fabric after making this statement. The top line from the new fabric is that it now reflects over 114 million broadband serviceable locations, a net increase of 1.04 million. That's a net adjustment of less than 1%. So it's only a net adjustment of less than 1%. However, there was some added and there were some removed. So there was actually bigger changes than is reflected here in that 1%. She says we've added 2.96 million new broadband serviceable locations. Percentage-wise, we saw some of the most significant increases in Alaska, U.S. territories, and tribal lands. And you would expect that because those are going to be some of the more rural areas, and also some of the areas maybe that don't have broadband now and have maybe larger properties or areas and more structures on properties, those kinds of things. At the same time, we have removed 1.92 million locations. And that would be because they were finding structures like garages, cow sheds, those kinds of things where it's like, okay, well, this was identified as a broadband serviceable location, but the cows don't need broadband in that particular location. Maybe in some structures where cows are, they do, but not in that particular one. Location challenges from states led to nearly 122,000 of the new location additions. So states were a big factor in making those challenges. But the majority of location additions and other adjustments were a result of the ongoing efforts of CostQuest. Again, that's the company they contracted with to make the initial fabric, and CostQuest is continuing to try to improve that. That was through refining their models and processes and using better input data sources such as new and more granular parcel data. Providers use this improved location data for their second required filing of availability data. So that would be referring back to that fabric that came out end of December that providers started inputting their availability on in January. And that concluded March 1st. So that broadband fabric is now, that broadband availability data now is on the fabric. And it will be displayed on the map later this spring. So maybe she really did mean the broadband map, even though she continued to talk about the fabric, because that's, to me, is saying that the broadband fabric obviously was the second fabric that came out in late December. And then service providers have uploaded all of their availability data, which ended March 1st. So now basically they got everything there. So they've got the fabric, they've got the broadband availability data. Now what's still happening are challenges. And as she said, every couple of weeks, there are challenges to this availability data. I don't know about location data, if that would be taken into effect on the broadband map. But as she says, every 2 weeks, you may see changes to where broadband service is available. I don't know if that might also reflect some location challenges. But certainly any location challenges that continue to go on right now would be reflected on the next broadband fabric. That will come out in June. So I anticipate the map to be out in May, maybe sooner. Because they've got data now. They've got the broadband fabric. They've got the availability data on top of that. They're continuing to do some challenges, and basically that all just needs to come out in the broadband map. And then June 30th is when the NTIA, let's say that date or sooner, is when the NTIA plans to announce, because they'll have this data, how much each state is going to get from the BEAD program. Each state's going to get $100 million. Everybody gets that. And then the remainder of the $42.45 billion that's available in BEAD will be distributed based on how many unserved locations a state has compared to the rest of the states or the entire unserved locations in the country. And that's why this information was needed. We needed to find out, number one, how many broadband serviceable locations there were, and then how many of those were unserved. So those are your two factors that we need to figure out. So once the NTIA has that information, which will be in the next broadband map, they can make their decision on how much each state is going to get. She says, we remain on track to release new and improved maps later this spring. This program would not have been possible without the extensive engagement of state and local leaders. We will release a national broadband map this spring that more closely reflects the state of connectivity on the ground, and we'll do it again and again and again every 6 months. So this is an ongoing process. Again, the first iterations of this is to figure out how much money each state will get. But after that, this is going to be a continuing process. It'll get better. There will be additional errors that will be fixed in the next iteration of the map that will come out, sometime, let's say in November. So we got one coming out in May, then the next one will probably be again in like mid-November, and that will have some fixes in it, but certainly hopefully fewer. And hopefully eventually there really won't be any errors. It will be just changes in broadband service, which will most likely be new areas that maybe you're built up, new neighborhoods, changes in the speeds of service that are available as internet service providers update their filings and they say, you know what, we rolled out gigabit service in this territory in the last 3 months, and we're going to go ahead and update the map. So you'll see those kinds of changes as well. So this will be an ongoing process. Now, people worry about the amount of money that states are going to get. It's like if this map is not correct enough, then some states are going to be shorted here. And some states may, if they haven't been keeping on top of this and doing challenges, I suppose they could have shortchanged themselves. But, as far as locations go, hopefully service providers in the areas have put in a lot of challenges. States, as we saw, have put in a lot of challenges. And hopefully the location data is correct. And hopefully by this next map coming up, most of the broadband availability is correct to the point where it won't have a significant impact on the amount of funds. It will be negligible and it won't have an impact on the amount of funds that each state will get. Now, there's still could be some problems on there. There could be some areas where it's like an MSO, major provider, national provider says they're serving a particular neighborhood and they're not. While that might not have a significant impact on the money that the states get, the state can still, if that map says that area is served and the state knows for a fact it's not, the state has control over that at that point. So they can challenge that at that point and say, well, this area says it's served, but it's not. So we are going to allow for federal funds to go to this area. They'll have to, I'm sure, document that or have some kind of way to say that, we know that this area is not really served, even though the map says it is. So there'll be those kinds of challenges. So the states do have some leeway. So the first part is how much money they get. And then from that point, there can be additional challenges that happen based on what's really going on the ground. So it's not like you're set in stone there and the state has to put funds in an area where it says it's served, even if they know it's not. So that's just something to keep in mind. So looks like, again, the map will be out when expected. They didn't want to delay it. A lot of people were asking that it be delayed 3 months, that, more challenges be able to be done. But they're trying to balance the fact that you've got the competing goals here. You want to make sure that you get everything accurate, but you also want to make sure that we can get this money out where it needs to be so it can start to get to work. We don't want to delay any longer. We want to get the funds out there so we can get these broadband projects started. Well, I appreciate you joining me. Thanks a lot, and hope this was helpful. If so, if you would give me a like on the video, I'd appreciate it. If you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button to be notified when I'm live. I will see you next week for Broadband Deployment News. Bye-bye.